know where it was going to lead us, but as you just heard, it kind of led us around everywhere, and it's really been an incredible journey. Want to get this out of the way. Dave and I are not historians, so this is important to know. We are communication scholars.
Well, now we're sort of historians.
Okay.
I mean, a little bit.
Okay. Maybe. I'm gonna let him have that, but we're communication people. And so we both grew up in Kentucky, and as you do in Kentucky, you hear broad strokes about Audubon. You know a little bit. I knew about him more of an artist. Some people know more about him from his science and as a naturalist. But our project was really to talk to different experts and to find out what they could tell us. And so really looking at different kinds of scholars, different types of expertise to piece together the connection between art and science and the way that Audubon influenced. The project started with a dean at the University of Southern Indiana at the time. He was a professor of art as well as dean of the liberal arts, Michael Aucus. And I was planning a field trip to Scotland, and he said, well, you should check out this guy named John Chalmers. He's just written a book about Audubon. Well, John is an orthopedic surgeon by trade, and during World War II, he was sent to the U.S. to get away from the war as a young child, as a young boy. And his American cousins introduced him to Audubon, and that began for him this sort of lifelong love. And that was really my first sort of introduction to Audubon and the scholarship and some of the other things about him at that time.
And the reason it clicked with him was because he knew that Edinburgh had a very strong connection to Audubon. Right? So,
Yeah.
right.
So I got back from this thing, and Michael says, you know, you should do a documentary. And that's all fine and good, except I don't do video. I do cultural research. I do interviewing. I do project management and grant writing, all these other kinds of things. But I don't know the video work, and this is where Dave comes in. So I'll let you pick up from there.
Yeah, well, so Leanne and I both work in the same Department of Communication and Media, or did. I'm now retired. And my area was professional before I got into academe was in broadcasting, and I worked. I went to Western Kentucky University and worked a little bit at WBKO there as a college student, and then went to work in Nashville at the CBS affiliate as worked lighting, camera, and so forth. So that was kind of my pre-background before getting into academe. And indeed, I'm from Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Leanne has more of a connection to the Louisville area. Right, I didn't know anything about Audubon. It really is, you know, it's a really satisfying experience when you're introduced to a new subject you don't know much about, and you kind of get sucked into it. You really dive into it, and that's the way Audubon was. So Leanne came to me and said, Dave, you know, and I'm probably simplifying it now, but what I remember was, Dave, I'm working on a video. Would you want to go to Edinburgh, Scotland, and shoot an interview? And I went, well, yeah. What's it about? Whatever. And so that was really the introduction. And actually, you know, the story of Audubon in Edinburgh is not the beginning, but that was the first thing to do, was to read a book about Audubon in Edinburgh. So that's how it got started, and how we got going. So what we do, the documentary is an hour long. We're not playing the whole documentary. We've edited it down to 30 minutes, and that is into 6 different clips. So we're going to play a clip and talk about, you know, what's coming up next and so forth, and that's how it works. Even within the clips, you know, they've been edited too. That's just my sensibility. You know, they're chopped up a little bit. So that's kind of how it is. And so Leanne will start off and introduce the first clip.
Okay. So as I said, when we get started.
Oh, yeah, we need the map.
Okay. So when we got started, we didn't really know what we were going to do, but there were a couple things we knew we didn't want to do because we'd seen another film or two. We knew we didn't want to do reenactments. There is one Audubon biography in which clearly a female is riding on a horse across the countryside with a long reddish ponytail, you know, trying to reenact Audubon in the wilderness, and we knew we didn't want to have someone with French accents, reading different things in text. We knew we didn't want that. As scholars, we wanted to take a scholarly approach, so we set out to find scholars who could piece together the story of Audubon. We interviewed his biographer. We interviewed a journalist in Louisiana who had done a lot of work looking at Audubon's time in Louisiana. We went to the New York Historical Society and interviewed the curator who's in charge of the Audubon's original paintings. We went to Chicago and interviewed an ornithologist, and we also interviewed a contemporary gallery owner that distributes Audubon original, but also new prints of Audubon. And this kind of stalking in our title comes around because then we just followed him. We went to some of the different places where Audubon had traveled, followed his path, some time here in Louisville, some time in Henderson, and talked to these folks to put the story together. One interesting thing, and then we'll show you the clip, that as we were finalizing the project in 2022, in that time period, Audubon made national news. Because even though many people, particularly scholars, had known for decades that Audubon had owned slaves, it made the national news because his most recent biographer, Gregory Nobles, released a story in the National Audubon Society magazine talking about these slaves and his ownership. So here at the last minute, we had to figure out how to address this, because this was obviously an important thing that we wanted to do to make sure we acknowledged it without throwing away 10 years of work and without sort of interrupting what our goal was, which was really to focus on that relationship between art and science. David said it's not often that you start studying and working with a 200-year-old plus topic or subject and then find them in national news. And if you follow the national news story, you know that while many local chapters kept Audubon Society as their chapter title, others changed their title altogether. And just about a year and a half ago, the National Audubon Society chose to retain the name Audubon in their title.
So I think it, not an accurate count, but probably between a dozen and 24 chapters across the country. I forget the number. There's a lot of chapters, but I think between 1 and 24 did drop the name Audubon because of that. And so the National Audubon Society was under a lot of pressure as well with this, but that's kind of how it played out.
So we'll just watch the first clip.
Okay, I don't know what that was, but we don't need that.
In the early 1800s, an individual set out to explore the far reaches of North America with the goal of painting every species of bird that existed. John James Audubon's objective was as much a pursuit of knowledge as it was an act of creativity. In the nascent field of ornithology, his was not the first attempt at such an effort, but it would surpass those who preceded him and inscribe his name among the most celebrated of 19th century Americans in the fields of art and science.
A man would have to have an enormous ego and self-confidence to undertake this enormous Birds of America project that he labored upon so diligently.
He became one of the most traveled people of his own time, venturing into places where no one had ever been before.
Audubon was the kind of person who walked into the room and he had this incredible aura around him. You know that everybody looked at him. He was just, sparks were coming off of him. He was just so high energy.
He used his eyes and his gun. He didn't have the Roger Tory Peterson Field Guide to the Birds.
I think very simply you could say that nobody else has done it better.
Number one, like Elvis, he goes by one name. right? Given the time, given the circumstances, what the man achieved is monumental. You could stack him up against anybody. Look what the guy did on the frontier.
By the time he finished, Audubon had traveled from Labrador, Canada in the north, down to Key West, Florida, the southernmost tip of the continental U.S., and to Scotland and England and France, back and forth across 7 trips over the Atlantic Ocean. The fruit of this effort was the publication of the 4-volume tome, The Birds of America, and the 5-volume ornithological biography. Where The Birds of America showcased his artistry, the ornithological biography recorded his observations of avian behavior and physiology. Both detailed over 400 birds. Every species he could capture, draw, paint, document, and describe in exacting detail.
They are priceless, they are a national treasure, that you could not put a value on it, just like you could not put a value on Leonardo's Mona Lisa. And I like to call Audubon America's Leonardo because he has many of the same aspects, the interest in science and art, this ineffable quality, the idea of people becoming so involved with him and so emotional about him, just like they do with Leonardo. It was really a kind of Renaissance man before the Renaissance in America.
Today, in many places he traveled, one will find the name Audubon attached to a variety of organizations, places, and businesses. The most familiar use of his name is with the National Audubon Society. Formed in the late 19th century, the founders were inspired by the beauty of his art and dedicated their efforts to the conservation of birds and other wildlife. However, Audubon and his legacy is complicated for contemporary society. While among the first to note the impact of humans on wildlife and their habitat, he shot and killed thousands of birds in pursuit of his art. Even more problematic, Audubon, the son of a French captain who owned a plantation in Haiti, bought and sold slaves. Audubon relied on their labor as well as that of indigenous people, though he failed to acknowledge their contributions, just as he failed to acknowledge other collaborators over the years. The Audubon Society, along with its independent chapters, the birding community, and Audubon scholars, continue to re-examine the systemic racism and patriarchy embedded in Audubon's past, and to make the activity of birding and wildlife conservation more inclusive. Audubon arrived in the United States from France during a formative period of the American experience at a time of intense interest by European societies. The New World was seen as an undeveloped frontier full of mysteries, an exotic other that contrasted with the more cosmopolitan European society.
This was a new world, and there was competition. People were coming over to North America and South America and different countries in the world and going back to Europe. And the temptation was always there to be as exotic as you can be in your representation.
You people don't have any history, you don't have any monuments, you don't have any great art. That's another thing. Let's do some great art, folks. That hasn't that got to be a reason? You don't have any monumental anything. And so Americans were trying to prove that they were robust, prolific,
But in the late 19th century, one who studied the natural world by emphasizing personal observation and the use of illustration was referred to as a naturalist rather than a scientist. And in this, Audubon straddled the two disciplines of the arts and sciences.
One particularly interesting example to me is the biography of the hummingbird. It's all about getting close to a bird, seeing the bird, being seen by the bird, getting involved in this kind of exchange of looks. With Audubon, you have the direct encounter with the bird, very rarely in profile in his mature work, but engaged in some sort of activity. So the very term illustration doesn't capture what he's doing. His watercolors and the plates based on them are fields of force, really.
With Audubon, nature isn't a noun, it's really a verb. There's always something going on in his art. Birds are mating, they are preying, or they're being preyed upon.
The female red-headed woodpeckers eagerly reach for food offered by their males. A male and female common eider stand and fight for territorial possession. But these depictions upset some in the scientific arena. On one hand, Audubon the storyteller has been accepted as a brash, colorful personality, but some of his claims came under question and would place a tarnish on his reputation that still resonates. His assertion that the bird of Washington was a new species and larger in size to other eagles drew raised eyebrows. Doubt soon rose, since no other naturalist ever made such a discovery, and Audubon didn't have a dead specimen to back his claims. He was initially accused of misidentifying the bird, but later charged with intentional exaggeration. Critics have later alleged Audubon with plagiarism, arguing his bird was knowingly designed from the previous works of others. His depictions were also criticized for the emotional and dramatic qualities that he instilled, being guilty of anthropomorphism, that is, imbuing his birds with human-like qualities.
And he has been criticized for being anthropomorphic, and he actually really isn't, because if you observe the animal world and the avian world, they do have, depending on the species, they exhibit the qualities that Audubon show. For example, the Eskimo curlew, which is now 99.99% extinct. He has the male bird looking at the female bird, who is clearly deceased in the foreground, and it's a very bleak landscape because it's a Labrador scene. And she has her wing exposed, and people have said, oh, that's because the species has unique coloration on the inside of their wings. But the bird is looking quizzically with his head cocked, and it's really very, very common. Birds that mate for the season or for life, when a mate dies, they will continue looking at that bird until they are convinced that it is deceased. We are the ones who are putting the anthropomorphism into Audubon's pictures. He is recording avian behavior.
So, Audubon was born in the Caribbean, but he was raised in France by his father and stepmother. And even at a very young child, he became interested in nature, and particularly birds. But as a teenager during this Napoleonic Wars, his father sent him over to the United States, where his father owned a farm, owned land over there to manage it and to get away from the war. And so there he became more formalized in his approach to how he wanted to draw and paint birds. And so that's kind of how that started.
So when does he get to America? 18 what?
Oh golly, where's that? Yeah, here. I got it right.
1803, is that right?
Let's see. He 1803. That is correct.
And he's how old at that
Like
time?
18.
18, okay.
Yeah, 18 years old. So young, and he gets started very young. So so now this next clip is going to get into the technique of how he got to draw, and that was one problem was how do you study a bird in order to draw it? They move around all the time, and so he figured he had to shoot and kill them, and so he found a way to. He tried different things, but he ended up mounting them on a board that you'll see here. So that's kind of what it is, and you'll see that the demonstration is by Bob Stagg, who is a former professor at Spalding College or University. And so we came here to Louisville to interview him and to give a real demonstration of how Audubon drew his birds.
Artist Robert Stagg demonstrates the use of a grid system and how Audubon achieved the accuracy in his drawings. Here, Stagg carefully pins a tufted titmouse in a natural pose that Audubon might have made. Once mounted, the drawing begins.
I can start from a position, say, about here, and the wings curve outward, and then back down across the line, at about a third over. I can measure back, down 1, 2 units, crossing just about like this, and like this. The tufted titmouse has a little peak, and that's what I'm trying to establish right now, where that is.
Audubon developed his artistic style utilizing a variety of techniques and materials. He was never comfortable working with oils, nor was it a practical medium to use while traveling the frontier. Watercolors were common for ornithological art, and Audubon used them, but he wanted something more.
He discusses about how ornithological illustrators were very dry and they used watercolor. They had the translucent watercolors over them, over these hard lines that an etching will give. He didn't like that. He wanted to use something that had texture.
I've laid in an undercoat of watercolor, and I'm going to layer on top of that some pastel, which is a technique that Audubon followed. It allowed him to work rapidly and capture what he believed were the fading colors of the bird after death. This layering of media created for Audubon, I think, a much more realistic depiction of the bird, and brought it back to life. It creates a kind of textural effect when completed that could never be duplicated by the printers, no matter how experienced.
And I have to add, it's the first time I've ever stood over the shoulder of someone who is creating a piece of art, a piece of a painting. And it was fascinating, you know, to actually, I mean, you know, because he first starts off, I'm going, well, okay, I wonder how nice this is going to be. And it's like, and I really wanted to ask him if we could take it, but you know, we didn't do that. So that was cool.
Yeah, his steadiness of hand too is amazing. It has to be, but still, it was.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So is he painting out in the field? I mean, he's
Yes.
lugging all this stuff out, wherever he's killed the bird?
And I'm told that's one reason, you know, he never was comfortable with oils, but that wouldn't have been practical. And
It
that
would have dried. It wouldn't have dried in time, you know, and the
Okay.
oil wouldn't.
So, I
So-
mean, does he, like, shows up somewhere and rents a house, or, you know?
Early 1800s, I don't think so. You know, he took
I
it
mean,
with him.
he's got a tent with him, and.
He's camping in some places. He has two of his enslaved who are with him. While he's hunting for birds, they're also hunting for birds, but they're also hunting for food and doing cooking and those kinds of things. So, I mean, you know, again, you're talking 1800s, so there's not a lot of development happening around here, you know.
You know, I
it's
guess
In
the work-
Kentucky, you still get killed by the Indians and, you
Yeah.
know, come close.
Well, you know, the work ethic was different back then too, apparently.
So as Dave mentioned, Audubon is a lifelong sketcher. You know, he did this as a young child and continued to do this, obviously through his whole life. But there were a couple things that changed his focus from a kind of hobby to like, maybe I can make a living on it. And interestingly enough, two of those things happened right here in Kentucky. And one of the things that happened, and this is around 1819, his business collapsed, okay? It has been debated as to why it collapsed. There was an economic crisis happening at that time. Some people attribute it to that. Some people attribute it to Audubon's lack of interest in business, or his poor business skills, which I'm not sure that it's so much poor business skills, because he was incredibly effective at the end of his career when he was trying to figure out how to produce and make and get subscriptions to Birds of America, or some combination of that. But at any rate, his business here in Kentucky collapsed. He served time in debtor's prison here in Louisville for a while. And during this time, he started drawing to make a living. And in this clip, you're gonna see a couple of chalk drawings of local, meaning Louisville people, that he drew to make money. He also drew what I call death drawings. I'm not really sure what they're really called, but people would hire him to draw their loved ones after they died so that they would have a picture of them. So he started doing these pictures and these portraits after his business failed. The other thing that happened, and this is...
What was the business that failed? What kind of business?
He had a mill in Henderson predominantly, but mercantile as well.
Well, yeah, Louisville and Henderson were mercantile, and then, but yeah, they started up a mill in Henderson, and that failed. He had he worked with a partner at a steamboat, and that turned out not well for him. So there were things that happened in his business side. He was actually successful in Henderson as well. They did pretty well, but anyway, had some hits.
So you had this business collapsing, but 10 years before that, this is while he was in Louisville, a man named Alexander Wilson stops by his business. And Wilson is a Scottish ornithologist, and he has just put together a collection of drawings of American birds. And he is wanting to see if Audubon will subscribe, buy a copy of his birds. And his business partner at the time, and those were being published in Philadelphia, which is also significant. But his business partner at the time tells him in French, yours are better. Don't buy those, yours are better. And Audubon does not. Wilson heads on his merry way. But this is a really significant meeting. One, because Audubon is now realizing that he might be able to do something with his drawings. And it also becomes significant because when he has enough drawings to pursue publishing, he goes to Philadelphia, which would be the head of American science and publishing in the U.S. at that time, and he can't get any supporters. And it goes back to this meeting with Wilson. Robert Ord and some of the other scholars, the scientists up there, they don't want competition for Wilson, who they've supported. So I've always found it kind of interesting that a Scottish person, a Scottish ornithologist, comes to the U.S., gets published. An American naturalist doing the same thing can't get published in the U.S., and he goes to Scotland, where he finds success. So a little bit of irony here. Let's start the next clip.
After 3 years, Audubon gave up managing the Mill Grove farm. He moved to Louisville, Kentucky, a bustling frontier town along the Ohio River, and opened a mercantile store. The following year, he married Lucy Bakewell, who he knew from Mill Grove, and the two settled in Kentucky to raise a family. In the years to come, Lucy would provide her husband much-needed support to undertake the long, arduous travels in assembling the Birds of America. For now, Audubon kept up a painting regimen, although he still had no real plans for anything greater than his own satisfaction. Soon after, Audubon and Lucy, with baby in tow, moved downriver to Henderson, Kentucky. There they lived a comfortable life until an economic downturn, along with poor business ventures, placed him in debtor's prison back in Louisville. When he and Lucy lost much of their belongings to settle their legal entanglements, Audubon turned to his creative talents to support his growing family, which now included 2 sons.
That's when he realized that he might make a living as an artist, when he began doing black chalk portraits of people. And they were selling like hotcakes because
There were no cameras in 1819 and 1820. The only way you could get an image of someone in your family, and he often drew people who were dying, and sometimes even people who were recently dead. There's one story where a family actually exhumed the body of a little 3-year-old girl who had died and laid her on a table so that Audubon could draw her, as he said, as if still alive.
I think one of the most interesting parts about Audubon is that if he had not failed in his early adventures, we would have never known him as the great artist that he is today. He may not have had the opportunity to explore that part of himself.
After 13 years in Kentucky, Audubon accepted a position with the newly formed Western Museum upstream in Cincinnati while continuing to draw. But the poor economy caught up with them there as well. Now, he and Lucy made the fateful decision. They would turn their sights full-time toward creating the birds of America and, in turn, expanding the scope of ornithology as it existed at that time. Eventually, there was a need to expand beyond the Ohio Valley to pursue new species. So in 1820, less than a year after moving to Cincinnati, Audubon said goodbye to his family and at age 35, hitched a ride on a flatboat on a southern course down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to Louisiana to embrace a new, ambitious venture, one the family would devote the full of their lives. And work began right away, shooting, drawing, painting, dissecting, and documenting birds as the boat floated its slow 3-month journey. Settling down with little money, his portraiture art and tutoring, along with Lucy's later work as a governess, would be their only support.
So, the Louisiana southern part of the United States was really good for Audubon as far as a whole different collection of birds, and he continues to develop his technique, so the quality in his perception of his art, increased, and so did very well. But they were financially strapped down there. He wasn't making money off Birds of America yet. And so Lucy had a variety of jobs. Audubon had to work a variety of ways as well. And he moved, he was up in Natchez, he was at St. Francisville, north of New Orleans for a period of time. So that was a real struggle, but it was really good. So he's involved in painting, and the next clip then really kind of gets into the, what do you do with it? So, because what he's doing, Audubon is not creating paintings and then selling paintings. He's taking the paintings and having them printed and published, and then finding subscribers. You don't have stores you can go to and buy an Audubon back then. So that's really the goal here. And so now this next clip gets into the printing process. So you'll see Michael Aukus, who was our dean at Liberal Arts, who got us into this project because he was very involved with the Audubon Museum over in Henderson, very involved with it. He's an expert in that copper engraving process and printing process. And so he could demonstrate it very well for us. So here it is.
Once enough drawings were created and their finances depleted, the Audubons went looking for a publisher. Specialized skill was required to reproduce the intricacies of his work. Art professor Michael Aukus recreates the process Audubon's engravers, William Lazars and Robert Havel, used during that period.
As I begin to go, I'll be looking at all of the very fine detail, and I'll be laying those out in lines and drawing to try to reproduce as much as possible the qualities of the original that are in the plate, and laying out all those wonderful little lines that Abel had placed to reproduce the qualities of the feather. And in the original drawings, we would have had Audubon laying out much of the details of the feathers. You're looking for line, you're looking for variations in light and dark, so that I'll be basically trying to follow as closely as possible the material that is coming through the tissue paper
that I can see, and then laying in those values that are visible to the eye.
Once traced, a copper plate is prepared by smoothing down the edges before applying a protective coating to the surface.
We use some asphalto, which is a ground, which is asphalt basically, but a very highly refined version of that, and then thinned way down so that we can put on a very thin layer of this over the entire surface of the plate.
Next, the trace drawing is transferred to the coated surface using a high-pressure roller press. In Audubon's time, the press was manually operated by a flywheel, but today one has the benefit of an electric motor. The image must now be etched into the plate itself. The process of manually scratching into a copper plate is a tedious one, requiring concentration and patience to accurately reproduce the detail in the drawing. Once finished, the plate is then submerged in an acid bath, where only the exposed copper is etched.
And begin to etch away the copper that's exposed in these lines where we've got our scratches. So that will allow us to actually put into the plate these lines in a much deeper way than it would be just by doing the light scratching. And we'll begin to get some bubbles that will appear on the surface of that right on the lines. And you can see we're getting some action, we're getting some good action on this plate. And there you can see bubbles forming right there, particularly in this area right here. And then coming up to the surface. And it can take the speed that this is etching anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes in the solution. Should give us a good bite on this plate.
Once the plate is cleaned, the actual printing can take place. That final process is demonstrated with one of Audubon's original copper plates. The museum at the Audubon State Park in Henderson, Kentucky has in its collection 2 of Havel's rare plates, and for the first time in 150 years, prints were made at the University of Southern Indiana across the Ohio River in nearby Evansville. It was questionable whether the printing expertise for such a large project existed in the U.S. or whether it would be necessary to look overseas in England. When the Audubons sought a publisher, they first looked at the work being done in Philadelphia, then the country's intellectual center and home of the Academy of Natural Sciences. But his brash personality and overconfidence ran into a political wall with the Academy Vice President George Ord, involving a shared acquaintance from Kentucky, Alexander Wilson.
George Ord, who really stands in the way of Audubon getting accepted to the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences and of being accepted as an expert on birds, he has both economic and personal motivations to keep Audubon's work from appearing. He'd been a great friend of Alexander Wilson, the author and artist of American Ornithology. Ord produces a little biographical sketch in which he refers to Wilson as the father of American ornithology, and he talks about how we were blessed by Almighty Providence that he sent this great father of American ornithology to this place at this time so that his genius could be realized. I mean, when you're talking about that kind of praise, you can see the personal animosity that he might have towards Audubon, because apparently Audubon didn't make any secret of the fact that he thought Wilson was wrong about some of his birds. When Audubon came to Philadelphia in 1824, Ord was already looking at publishing a new edition of American Ornithology. And if Audubon came out with a new book that had 200 more birds in it, that would pretty much undercut the demand for Wilson's republication. We think of publication history, and particularly when it comes to Audubon's Birds of America, well, of course people would have wanted to publish it because it was destined to become a classic. They certainly didn't make it into print in America because of personal and financial concerns of the man who was publishing a rival book. And I just think that kind of detail about the publishing history of such a now well-known book is just utterly fascinating.
So I want to share a story. It's not actually in the video, but I think it's kind of interesting. The copper plates are really rare that you saw, and Audubon Museum has 2 of them.
Are you talking about plates generally or Audubon?
I'm talking about the Audubon plates.
Okay.
And the Audubon Museum really is Audubon and things related to that. I mean, it's really the largest collection probably in the world, honestly, of Audubon stuff in one place, which is kind of interesting for a state park in Kentucky. But I don't think this is in the video, but what happens later after Audubon dies, his wife is basically impoverished. And so she's trying to make money, and she's trying to sell these copper plates, and she can't do it. She can't sell them. So she ends up selling them for scrap metal. And the story is, and there are a couple of verified on this, is that a little boy sees this happening and runs and tells his mother and saves what few are out there. So we don't really know how many plates of the original 430 whatever are left, but we do know there aren't many, perhaps less than 130 in the Audubon, if that many, and the Audubon Museum has 2 of them. So that's a little interesting fact.
So the people who are doing the etching of the plates, I mean, they're as fine an artist as Audubon is.
Funny you should mention that, because I'm going to talk about that right now.
Okay, sorry.
All right, that's okay. So he's blackballed in the U.S. He comes to Britain to get an engraver and publisher, and it's almost instant success. If you look at when we know he landed and what the media, the newspaper at the time are saying in Edinburgh, it seems like he has a show within days at the Royal Society. I mean, things happen really quickly for him. And it's because all these scientists connect him. And Audubon ends up being connected by the time it's all said and done, with 2 of the greatest engravers in the world at the time. And the first one is William Home Lazars, who was there in Edinburgh, and he does the first 10 plates. Lazars is also the person who commissioned the portrait of Audubon. It's the one that's on our poster with the long, flowy, autumn-like hair. But then his colorists, so when they come off that plate, there are usually women in a room hand coloring each of these colors on every one of these prints. And these colorists that Lazars has goes on strike, so he has to find a new engraver. This sends him to London, where he meets up with Robert Havell Sr. and Robert Havell Jr. And this gets to your question. Audubon just painted birds. So when you see a picture of a background, you wouldn't see that on the original painting if you go to the New York Historical Society and look at Audubon's original painting. You might see some vague outline of a sketch, but you're not going to see the detail that you see actually on the prints that most of us are familiar with, because this is what Havell did. You had a man who'd never been to the U.S. filling in these backgrounds on the birds that you see.
Like the cattails or the
any of that, any of the water, any of the trees. Now, some of the vegetation where you'll see, like in a bird's mouth, some of the florals, some of it was done by 3 collaborators that are never, again, that he never identifies. 3 young painters, Joseph Mason, Maria Martin, and George Lehman. He hires these young artists to do some of that work, but by and large, a lot of the creativity, aside from all the bird, goes to Havell. And what Audubon ends up doing is having a real close conversation about what the engraving should look like and how it should be done. I mean, the reason it took so long for all the birds of America to come out was because Audubon was so involved in this. So Audubon worked with 2 of the greatest publishers and engravers at that time, and we really can't underestimate particularly the works of Martin, Mason, Lehman and Havel in terms of what he contributed.
Before proceeding on to London to find a publisher, Audubon decided to venture north to Edinburgh, Scotland.
And when he came, he found Edinburgh in what was known at that period as the Scottish Enlightenment or the Golden Age. Edinburgh was a ferment of intellectual activity, and Audubon was caught up in this. And when he arrived, he just loved the city. He was immediately attracted to it, and he liked the people he met and the hospitality he received. And Lazar's, when he came to see Audubon's paintings, was immediately taken by them. And he saw Audubon's paintings and realized that they were way ahead of two other bird books that he was happened to be engraving the illustration for at that time.
And he certainly sought out the approval of other scientists, and he sought membership in scientific organizations. And after becoming a member of various organizations, he used that abbreviation together with his name, displaying it proudly. He never really, I think, sought that sort of acceptance within the artistic community.
With printing underway, Audubon, a master of self-promotion, began selling his works in subscription form. Although a common approach used at that time, his was unique.
He departed from other ornithological illustrators in terms of how he instructed Havel to organize the birds of America. He decided he was going to organize them not by taxonomy, but rather, as he said, according to nature. And of course, according to nature was surprise, because it would be very dull and very boring if you were a subscriber and opened your 5 prints that you would receive every 6 weeks to 2 months. And you had 60 seagulls, just think how many months you'd have of seagulls. 40 sparrows, just how many months of sparrows. No one would open the boxes. But then he would do something amazing. He had 1 large bird, the full size of the double elephant folio, 1 medium bird, and 3 small. Many times they were songbirds. So again, you had a mixture of everything. Sometimes you were in the swamp, sometimes you were in the trees, but you would have a mixture of things. So you always were kept on your feet so that it would be like nature. It would be a surprise. It would always be a new unfolding story.
Once he ran out of potential subscribers, he traveled south for new prospects, eventually landing in London. While there, his collaboration with Lazar's in Edinburgh unexpectedly became short-lived with just a few plates created.
He, quite by accident, meets Robert Havel, and Havel happens to be, at that particular time, the world's greatest engraver.
Havel really intuitively recognized the importance of this work, and in some cases knew better than Audubon really what was good for a plate.
Havel Jr. contributed a unique visual element to Audubon's birds involving a technique called aquatinting, a complex process that adds shading and 3-dimensional form to the lines that are already etched. Here, a print from a Havel plate shows the various stages of aquatinting, creating different levels of shading. In contrast to a Lazar's print, where shading is created only by the engraved lines and the applied painting.
In the flamingos, you see not just the silhouetted single huge large bird in the foreground that you have in the watercolor model, you see other flamingos in the background. Well, these were added on Audubon's instructions. In the magnificent frigate bird, which Darwin, of course, loved, and Darwin had heard Audubon's first lecture in Edinburgh, in the watercolor, which is an incredible work. He shows iridescence here with a combination of watercolor and wash. It's not a black bird, but it has purples and turquoise and greens, and then over that 10,000 strokes of graphite for every barb of every feather.
And you see Audubon trusting him, beginning to trust him, sometimes only sketching an outline of something. When you think of the plate of the roseate spoonbill, for example, he just indicates with a few kind of strokes of the pencil how that landscape is supposed to look like, this kind of watery landscape that we see behind this extraordinary bird. And Neville just goes ahead and finishes it.
By the time Audubon reached London, he had secured close to 100 subscriptions, but there were challenges ahead. The printing by Havel needed constant oversight. The written text for the ornithological biography had yet to begin. More subscriptions needed to be sold, and although a quarter of his birds had been completed, many more needed to be captured, drawn, and painted.
So he did all that. He made several trips back and forth over the Atlantic Ocean in order to manage what was going on in England, as well as selling subscriptions, getting out in the woods and, you know, shooting and then drawing and painting more birds. So Audubon was very successful, and when he would go back to the United States, he was recognized now for his work. And he had dinner with President Jackson, and you know, and as an example, so he was very successful person. He was getting to be more of a celebrity. And so now, and one other thing, you know, we don't show much here though, is the ornithological biography, which is sort of the academic side to this. He worked back in Edinburgh with William McGillivray, who was someone who was a naturalist of his own and who had more of a scientific background. So there was all of this detail, and there were several volumes of those that had to be published. And one reason, you know, the ornithological biography was not a part of the Birds of America, was really a licensing law back in the UK that was going to end up being very expensive. Then if you combine text with your artwork, you're going to have to put a publication in every library that they said. It was just one of those rules. So that's one reason they kept it separate. So anyway, this next clip kind of addresses, this is really post Birds of America. You know, how things went with them, and what some of the activity that he did after he had really gotten that going, and then the decline and end of his life and so forth, and what happened to the plates and so forth.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the ornithological biography is, think of that as the journal. Okay, so as he was doing these paintings, he was also keeping really extensive field notes. And he was making sketches. When he would dissect birds, he would make sketches of their organs. And he would write about their habitat, and he would write about the places where he found them. And so that's what the ornithological biography is. We've got the paintings in one set, Birds of America, and we have all of this information that he captured about the specific birds in each species in these journals. And so I just wanted to clarify that that's exactly what that was.
Yeah, and
How much is the subscription?
Oh, can't tell you, don't recall. No, but I mean, this was not for the masses.
I mean, is this like buying a car? I'm buying a car if I'm the wealthy person, or am I?
Yeah, because keep in mind how big they are. Each volume is probably this long and maybe this wide.
The video explains this, but he drew all birds life size. So a lot of birds little, but then some birds are very big. So he had to use the largest format of paper, which was called the elephant.
Double elephant.
The double elephant folio. And that's what it was. And then he was even criticized for the way he liked the flamingo. They said, well, why do you have the flamingo bent over? Well, flamingos can bend over, but that's the only way you're going to get it on the page, and so forth. So, yeah. Anyway, this is the way the documentary wraps up.
By 1838, all 4 volumes of the Birds of America were finished, some 18 years after Audubon had left Cincinnati, Ohio, to devote full time to the project. Soon after, a smaller version was started, the Royal Octavo edition, something more practical in size and affordable to a wider audience. The Birds of America made good money for the Audubons. They built their final home, a 3-story residence along the Hudson River on Manhattan Island, and for a short time lived a comfortable life. A year after moving in, however, at age 58, Audubon was on the move again, this time up the Missouri River to document mammals for a collection he called the Viviparous Quadrupeds of North America. But as the years passed, his eyesight and overall health declined. His sons would finish this last work. In 1851, suffering from a stroke and dementia, Audubon passed away at age 65. Within 10 years, both sons, Victor and John Woodhouse, died, leaving Lucy to support herself and the estate. With financial resources depleted, she sold Audubon's original paintings to the New York Historical Society, where they are periodically placed on display. The copper plates she could not sell, and many were sold as scrap. All of about 80 survive today. Audubon advanced the science of ornithology while raising the quality of aviary art to a new level. He doubled the known bird species in comparison to his contemporary Alexander Wilson. His paintings, drawn from nature, were an integral part of his science, an innovation for the time. His was a new spirit of inquiry. The detail that Audubon brought to his birds are found in the works of aviary artists today. He would likely be pleased with the attention to realism, but he might miss the drama. The popularity of his prints exemplified the matchlessness of his art. For many years, Audubon's birds were worth more individually to collectors than as a full set, but no more. Until 2013, the complete 4-volume The Birds of America held the highest single price paid in auction for a publication at $11.5 million. The complete sets that survive today, estimated at 120 in existence, will likely never be separated.
Even today, nearly 2 centuries after Audubon's death, the Birds of America continue to loom in the national imagination as the Sistine Chapel of American ornithology. It's the sheer abundance and variety of these paintings that really draws us to look closer. And to think that these paintings, as richly varied as they are, only indicate a fraction of the abundance that's in the landscape of Audubon's time and that continues to be in our landscape today is really an invitation for us. It's an invitation to wonder, and it's an invitation to awe, and it's an invitation to preserve the enormous abundance that we continue to have.
So, our goal, as I said at the beginning, we were wanting to look at the connection between art and science. That was what we were interested in as scholars. We were interested to hear what the experts had to say, because we knew they had the information that we didn't have. But again, as scholars, we wanted to be able to share the story in talks like this, but as well as through our documentary. Yeah, we've had a number of local screenings and talks. Our video is shown fairly regularly at the Audubon Museum, and I have to tell you, if you've not been to the Audubon Museum, it is a quick, easy drive across Indiana to Henderson, Kentucky. You can get there easily in 2 hours, and it's just an amazing gym in the middle of a Kentucky State Park. You don't have museums of that caliber and that kind of content
So
in
they
a state
do,
park.
They do have some of his
They
work?
have, it is the largest collection, assembled collection of Audubon stuff. If you exclude all the paintings at the New York Historical Society,
Okay.
it's all there. They've
Next
got,
in line.
yeah, they've got, you can see some of his early drawings.
Some
You know,
of
when
his
he was-
ancestors have given artifacts that they collected through the family.
Yeah, there's a beautiful amethyst pendant that the great great-great-great-granddaughter donated, while we were doing this project, we interviewed her. And she came down and did a talk and then made a donation to the museum. So you'll see a lot of those kinds of personal artifacts there. And there are lots of places, don't get me wrong, there are lots of places that'll have one print or two prints. Or they might have one piece of pottery or something that they think was Audubon, but you're just not gonna see the full thing until you get to Henderson, honestly. Our documentary we're really pleased to receive Best Hoosier Film at the Victory International Film Festival in 2023. Our documentary last year was accepted to be distributed nationally through PBS and educational television. So at this point, it's been shown on 48 stations in 20 different states. It was shown about 2 months ago for the second time on KET, which, by the way, if you contribute money to KET, you probably have access to their passport system, and that would let you watch the full documentary through their streaming service. And we've just had a lot of support from the community, from our university, and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and the Speed Museum was where we got the chalk prints.
Yeah.
Chalk art.
Yeah, they loaned us those. So that's it. I don't know. I know we're at time. I know you have busy days. We're happy to answer questions or talk with you. But thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you.